Hello, everyone, and welcome. I want to thank you all for joining us today for this free webinar presented by OpTalent. Today's session, Building the Workforce Behind ERP and Manufacturing, focuses on what really drives results: people. We'll look at how aligning your workforce, processes, and technology turns ERP from a system you install into real performance improvements on the shop floor. We'll spend about 1 hour today together, including some time at the end for questions. This session will be recorded and will be available on demand after the live event. So you'll receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording and the presentation slides by tomorrow. And as we move through the presentation, please submit any questions that you have using the Q&A panel or in the chat. We'll address as many of those as we can during that Q&A portion at the end. And as a reminder, please remember to stay muted during the session today. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenters, Jerron Rhodes and Jarrett Carson from OpTalent. Jarrett, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, good afternoon. Thanks for having us, Robbie. We're happy to be here. Can't wait to get started. Just going to share my screen really quickly. We got a good presentation for you guys. Really a conversation, though. Should be very relatable to everyone. Jarrett, let me know when you guys can see, if that's okay.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, beautiful. So yeah, good afternoon. Really appreciate everyone who's joining. Appreciate you guys spending part of your day with us. Also want to send a thank you to Robbie and the Sabre team, really for partnering on this session and bringing everyone together today. We understand many of you may already work with Sabre or on the system side, and today we'll be focusing on the people side, really that help support those systems. Okay, so the goal is really simple. We're going to share what we're seeing inside manufacturing teams during change, and give you a few practical ideas you can use in your own operations. So for today, my name is Jerron. I'm going to be one of the presenters from OpTalent, and I also have my colleague, Jarrett.
Yes, thank you for everyone for joining today. My name is Jarrett. I'm one of the managing partners here at OpTalent, really focused on the client development side at OpTalent. So I'm glad to be here and looking forward to discussing this important topic with you all. Amazing. So in understanding OpTalent and our history, just want to give a little bit of background, how we're built from the floor up. So OpTalent is about a decade old in the manufacturing industry. So we're embedded in real operations, definitely not observing from far. So about a decade ago, we originated from a company called OptiTest, which is our sister company. And they provide hands-on mechanical and electrical simulations on the shop floor to measure true capability, which also gives, data-driven insights to identify strong performers, pinpoint skill gaps, and guide targeted training across the shop floor. And organically through that, through our company, OptiTest, the evolution started bridging with OpTalent. So our partners asked, can you help us hire the right talent? We understand you can provide skills assessments, but can you help us find the right talent on the floor? So we consider ourselves beyond recruitment. We align skill, team structure, and timing with operational demand for lasting impact. So we really focus on performance and supporting manufacturing leaders through growth, automation, ERP transitions, and operational change.
Great. So yeah, quickly, here's an overview of how we'll be spending our time together today. We're going to start with what we're seeing across manufacturers presently, and then we'll walk through some trends on what happens on the floor when systems are changing or major projects are being introduced. And then we'll get into an effective workforce framework that we've put into practice. We'll finish with a few key takeaways that you can bring back to your team. So the goal today isn't just theory-based. It is really to give you something that you can start applying as soon as you leave this call. And with that being said, we wanted to start why this conversation matters. Okay, so quickly, we're seeing two things happen at the same time across most manufacturers right now. On one end of the spectrum, there's a push to modernize, right? So technology investments are increasingly new systems, automation, better digital dashboards and forecasting. All right. And at the same time, teams are also getting leaner. So here's where processes are changing quickly. Knowledge is being lost to retirees. And there is tension that tends to show up when change moves a bit faster than people can comfortably adapt to. All right. And that gap right there is mainly what this conversation will be about today and how to mitigate that and solve it. So we wanted to start with the visual, right, across manufacturers we work with. We're seeing pressures that show up in two main buckets. We have the people-centric challenges as well as the technology-centric challenges. First is people. So this can fall into many different parts, but it can be from hiring challenges to turnover. You have experienced people retiring, rising labor costs, and a bunch of other things as well, as I'm sure you may identify in your own business as you take a look. All right. And in the second bucket, that's where we find the technology-centric challenges. This can be, how are we looking at new systems? Are we increasing our automation? Let's enhance our data and faster implementations, right? So as you go through them, you'll realize that each challenge is demanding on its own. The real difficulty is that many of these are happening on the same time. We don't have the luxury of attacking one challenge and then moving on to the next, right? Teams are learning on the fly. They're learning new processes while also trying to keep your production moving. And that tends to be where friction shows up in your daily operations. All right. And slowdown happens in very predictable places. Here are some points where we most often see some ERP and our major project stall.
Yeah, so a lot of ERP and major projects stall a lot of times, from the top. So executive presence without necessarily alignment. So a lot of times roles and ownership aren't fully clear yet through that transition. So, you have your supervisors on the floor ending up juggling production and system issues, and people end up tending to fall back to familiar process to keep output moving. In essence, stakeholders eventually get disengaged after kickoff. So there's no clear ownership of decisions or data. And that data becomes inconsistent because processes aren't fully supported and adopted. So, end users end up excluded from planning, which, ends up being the capacity underestimated during go live. So, all in all, the stabilization takes longer than anyone planned. And these generally don't feel like technology problems inside the plant. They normally feel like daily operational problems. And this is usually where we see one common theme. The change moved, but the organization didn't move at the same pace. And with that, it's important to note why alignment matters. We have a little graph here that represents people, process, and technology. And people processing technology, when companies introduce new technology, the technology changes immediately, but processes take time to adjust and people take even longer. So the result of that is the system could be ready, but workflows and team habits still belong to the old environment. So it's important to understand that supervisors start doubling up, checking outputs. Operators keep shadow processes on paper and sometimes lose that paper process. Planners stop trusting the data. And none of this is really resistance. It's how teams protect production when they're unsure. So a couple key things to look at is ERP projects don't struggle because people resist change. They struggle when change reaches the system before it reaches workflows and the team. So when people, processing technology move together, adoption feels smoother. When they don't, the operation carries the stress. Instead of looking at ERP as a software rollout, it helps to see it as an operational change. And the place that change shows up first is mostly on the shop floor.
Great. So yeah, what you'll see is that most transformation projects are planned at a leadership level, executive board, right? But the change is actually implemented and felt on the production floor first. In a sense where your operators are going to begin to work differently, supervisors start managing a bit differently, maintenance starts documenting more instead of just fixing on the fly, right? And what often might get called as resistance is really just uncertainty. Okay, teams will begin to create workarounds until they trust the new process that you put in place. And ultimately, that is what slows down adoption. Okay, so it usually isn't the technical problem, it's usually the workflow change happening all at once. And here's what typically it looks like on the shop floor in the system when it's changing. So what you'll see here is that when a system goes live, right, the first thing that changes is very predictable. Of course, it's going to be the workflow. So that's expected. That's going to be your trigger. What follows from that, though, is where operations begin to feel it, which shows up in your training gaps, right? Training gaps appear. Those gaps turn into bottlenecks on the floor. And in order to keep production moving, you'll find that teams will begin to overcompensate in various areas, from overtime increasing to rework showing up a bit more, and pressure tends to really land on a few key experienced people. All right. The good news is, though, that things eventually do stabilize, but only after, as Jarrett mentioned, people catch up to the process. And that's why reframework workforce readiness is really a risk management practice and a tool. The more prepared your team is beforehand, then the faster you will go from the trigger all the way up to the stabilization. And what you'll see here, really just wanted to provide a visual as during any major change, right, everyone feels the shift. Okay, this is where a rollout stops being an IT project and really becomes an operational change. So your IT team aren't the only ones responsible for a successful rollout, just like your cybersecurity team isn't the only ones responsible for keeping a business secure. So as you go through the model, you'll see that operators might move from paper to digital workflows. Your maintenance logs are issued instead of just fixing them. Supervisors are now managing through dashboards instead of manually or walking the floor, right? So even though your system might sit in one department primarily, the change actually does touch other areas of the business. And if one group isn't ready, the whole operation, your whole business will feel it. And it's not because the system isn't right or that it failed, mostly because people are needing time to change out the way they work, right? And to this is very important where internal champions really start to matter in each area, as they will be the ones to help your business adapt. And that's a thought that we will connect back later in this presentation.
Great, thanks, Jerron. When you look at talent agility, it usually equals uptime. And on these two graphs, you'll see an unprepared team versus a prepared team. And after a systems change, leaders immediately start watching performance. And key questions to ask yourself on a leadership scale is, are we stable or are we just firefighting on a day-to-day? And a lot of times those metrics observed are downtime, overtime, and data accuracy. And as you see on the left, unprepared teams, when they're not ready, production slows, overtime rises, burnout does happen. Teams rely on workarounds to keep orders moving. Supervisors tend to troubleshoot instead of managing their folks on the floor. And a lot of times confidence in data ends up dropping. But when teams are prepared, operations normalize a lot faster. Supervisors return to production focus. Workflows are then followed, and the system starts working as intended because the buy-in is there. The software didn't necessarily change. The readiness of the people starts changing. That's when uptime holds and the investment begins to pay off as a team. So how do we prepare for a workforce that, instead of reacting to it, that's what our model is built to address, and we'll discuss further in future slides. So a proven workforce model for manufacturing agility, and we plan this out in terms of a plan, build, flex, and retain. And each core component is very important through the transition. So we look at how manufacturers build teams that adapt to change, not react to it. So why this matters? Across manufacturers, similar problems appear during major changes, ERP rollouts, new shifts, expansions. The difference isn't usually the system, it's how the team is structured around it. So when you look at an approach, we like to organize what we observe into a simple model: plan, build, flex, retain. And as we walk through these, think about your own operations, where things feel stable and where you feel pressure. So we're going to start with the planning stage. That is where we see the strongest teams and what they do before pressure shows up on the floor. So planning creates leverage as an organization. So anticipation builds into pressure events. and builds into stabilization. So when you look at planning and how much it matters before pressure hits, it's not just ERP planning. It applies to any operational pressure. That could be pressure including new shifts, automation installs, major orders, retirement system changes, and strong teams prepare beforehand. So they map skills across the workforce. They locate tribal knowledge. They identify exposure points early. And ERP doesn't create workforce problems, it exposes them a lot faster. So visibility creates options, and no visibility creates reaction. To summarize, planning will equal operational risk management, and you can't mitigate what you don't map out. So this sets up the conversation for building teams that flex under pressure. And in terms of flexing under pressure and looking at your readiness and risk planning checklist, there's 4 components to really look at, and it's really key to understand these components. And those 4 components are capacity and coverage, skills and tribal knowledge, leadership and pipeline, demand and change pressure. It's not that complicated, but it is often skipped many times. Most issues don't come from missing one of them, they come from not seeing how they all connect. So this checklist isn't necessarily about perfection, but it's about visibility. Once you can see where you're exposed, it's about visibility. So you can make smarter decisions about hiring, development, and flexibility. So in essence, planning isn't about predicting the future, it's about removing surprises.
Great. Thank you for explaining the plan. Next, we'll get into the build, right? So after you see where you're exposed, the next step isn't just hiring. It's more so thinking about how are we actively building the capacity, right? So what you'll see here is a diagram. Starting at the bottom, this is your shop floor. This is where your operators live, your technicians live, and this is really where processes and systems actually get used first, okay? And if this level isn't prepared, what you'll find is adoption will slow almost immediately because they'll go back to their workarounds and old habits instead of actually thinking about what works a bit better. All right, next level up, you'll have your middle ground. This is where your leads and your supervisors live. This will probably be the most critical layer in the business, as the biggest gap we tend to see is usually the jump from operator to your supervisors, right? Your supervisors, really, they turn change into daily work. We've seen that one prepared lead can stabilize an entire shift, right? And everyone kind of follows a good leader. Then at the top, there's where you have your functional champions. So these are super users. They should be cross-department, whether that's your quality team, right, your maintenance team, your finance leaders, and your overall ERP super champions. Okay, so these are the go-to. These are other people rely on. They champion your processes across the business. And really, adoption moves faster when you have these internal consultants or champions versus someone external coming in and trying to tell people what to do, right? They don't have that internal cachet already built up. And a key thing to note is that through these levels, communication must be transparent. It needs to go up, down, and top to bottom. Okay, cross-training matters a lot because you want to prepare people for the next role before you need them. So all in all, don't just let knowledge sit with one person, rather tend to build depth across the levels. Often this means developing people you already have internally instead of always trying to hire outside resources. So here, what you'll find is really 3 pivotal questions that we recommend manufacturers ask for their operations, right? The first being, if one person left tomorrow, where would we feel it first? Okay, this will uncover your surface, your hidden risk. Then you have like, which roles would slow everything down if they were suddenly unavailable? Okay, and a third key question would be, if an important person left tomorrow, do we have a realistic internal pipeline to fill their position, or would we need outside support to replace them? So the purpose of these questions is a very good starting point on assessing your over-reliance, how you're building capacity. And once the capability exists internally inside the team, then the next pressure is really, how do you handle changes without overwhelming or overloading your team? And that's where the flex in our model comes in.
Great. Yeah. So when we talk flex, it's design capacity that adapts. So when we're planning flexibility before demand spikes, agility will always beat firefighting. So as you see, plan surge capacity and your core team, this would include, a blend of project-based roles, contract specialists, float cross-trained staff, and manufacturing operations never really run at a steady state. Pressure points are predictable. However, systems change. Seasonal ramps do happen, audits, major orders, automation installs. The flexibility isn't about reacting faster. It's about planning capacity ahead of time. So you can't look at it as a contractor versus full-time. It's designing the right labor mix. Define what must stay core, what can be flexible, and what can't depend on one person to operate. So that surge capacity protects your core team. It doesn't replace it. When flex is planned, teams stay stable and focused. And when it isn't, overtime happens, burnout happens, and quality issues follow. And these are also three key questions to ask your operations as you go through this change. Where do we expect pressure? And what's our plan when it hits? Another question to ask is, if demand spikes next quarter, who absorbs the load? And are we protecting our core team or burning them out during peaks? These are important to ask because it forces visibility. You can't manage what you can't see. Focus is on capacity and workforce readiness, not just technology in the system. So planning for flex is cheaper and more effective than reacting to crisis. These questions anchor the conversation for operational resiliency. So we're looking at the next concept of retain, and that's a huge, huge thing for all manufacturers across Canada and the US. Retention protects capability. When people stay, capability compounds. So through retention, you're keeping capability and not just your headcount. And after the change, teams hold new skills and workflows. So they're upskilling themselves. If key people leave, the investment leaves with them, unfortunately. So all of the cross-training and the training you've done is definitely down the drain. So drivers of that retention would be to support and maintain that clarity during change to drive engagement across the floor. Teams stay when they understand why things are changing, and intentional retention is really stable performance and equals realized ROI. So change fatigue happens when change feels imposed on the people, and flex helps absorb that change. Retention is what keeps the gains. Retention is definitely not passive. It's an active strategy to protect capability. And these are another set of questions to ask during the retain period. Do our people feel more confident after the change or more exhausted and burnt out? And what are we intentionally doing to keep critical people engaged once project pressure starts fading? Another very key question to ask is, do our top performers see growth and stability here, or just more responsibility and hats? So retention definitely isn't passive. It requires intentional actions. So focus on protecting capability, not just your headcount. Strong retention equals stabilized performance and sustained ROI overall. These questions help leaders identify risk before turnover happens before gains.
Great. Thank you for sharing that, Jarrett. So yeah, this is an overview. This is an overview of the operator model that we've seen consistently work, right? Simple structure with a big operational impact. Okay, so just to kind of reiterate a couple points here, we'll start with the plan. That's where you map your risk early. You see where your risk exists in your business. The next step after that, once you identify that, goes into the build. How are we developing the capability? Do we have the right headcount? And then after that, you get into your flex, right? This is where you're absorbing pressure without overloading or overbearing your current workforce. Okay, and all of that naturally will lead into retention or retain, which is where, how are we keeping the knowledge and the equity that we built up internally so we can realize our true value. The interesting thing about this model is that retain will lead right back into your plan, right? Because you need a plan on your retaining, and now where it's a full cycle. Okay, so together this really moves teams from being reactive into a proactive state, and you're achieving at the top of your goals is really operational stability after the new workflows and the trigger began. Okay, so this is really where we see the connect. As we go back to our earlier slide with the operational pressures, in the middle, you would have observed a transformational success. This is when we get both sides of the pressures moving in the right direction, and there's accountability across different angles. So rather than keep this all theory though, we want to show what this looks like in practice. So we do have a couple practical examples for you all that we're going to run through. These are real manufacturers that we worked with, and we want to show you guys exactly the impact, the problem, and the solution as well.
Absolutely. So, case studies can be provided through a ton of different examples. However, I wanted to keep it relevant. We worked with an Ontario custom metal fabrication manufacturer, about a 95 user shop, where they were mid ERP rollout, and they were seeing a lot of operational pressure. So supervisors were juggling production and ERP system issues at the same time. Schedules checked manually because the system wasn't fully trusted by everyone. Teams running paper alongside ERP, creating double work and confusing everybody. And inventory delays, slowing delivery of customer orders, which equals, customer dissatisfaction. The intervention happened when people started to realize that assigning a dedicated ERP owner to clarify accountability on each front. There was an added MRP planner to support and manage production schedules, increase floor capacity to reduce the bottlenecks. And there was also a designed super user on the shop floor to support the adoption along the way. So the operational result of that was supervisors could then focus on production gain, fewer production delays and less overtime, less burnout. And then in essence, the schedule stabilized and workflows followed. So ERP adoption improved because the team trusted the system. So to summarize this case study, the ERP system didn't fail necessarily, the organization around it did. Planning, ownership, support, and capacity made all the difference in this scenario.
Great. So here's the case study number 2. Slightly different example for you all. So here we're working with a cross-border concrete manufacturer. All right, they have multiple plants, all different sizes, spread across Canada as well as the US. The situation there is that they were looking at rolling out a Lean Six Sigma practice, right? They were doing ERP improvements as well as looking at implementing a digital quality system. All of this is a lot. They're trying to do it all at once. On paper, they thought the setup was correct, but each plant was really still doing things a bit differently in its own way, in that the same issues kept coming up, forthcoming, right? Each site solved problems a bit differently with their root cause analysis, and our supervisors were really leaning on a few key experienced people, right? So we realized that really knowledge, we're living with individuals, not quite with the operation, which is problematic in that it looks like it's a systems problem, but really it wasn't. Instead, they had to look at their operations and be like, hey, a few things did end up being adjusted. All right, so in terms of what changed, leadership defined ownership across locations. This was very key. This was the starting point of accountability. They also added regional quality leaders. The key thing here is not only were these leaders fluent on the floor in operations, but there were also systems and digital savvy, which ended up helping with their overall adoption as they became the champions for the change, right? In a sense where you see your floor, your quality technicians, shop floor talent finally had someone that they can trust on the floor who they can go to with their questions instead of just creating workarounds automatically. Okay, and within a short time, what you would see is that the company training became more consistent, a bit more stabilized. Okay, procedures across the plants were in greater alignment, and root cause analysis had greater documentation, which had a tremendous impact across the business. So once the operation became consistent, the technology and the systems in place really started working the way it was supposed to. So yeah, for this next section, we want to put this into practice. Okay, we walked through where problems tend to show up during change. Now the goal is really to take a look at your operation, try to make change and challenges visible, right? So instead of leaving it at just examples, we'll show you a lens that you can use before your next project, rollout, ramp up, or any major change across the business. So here we have our ERP Workforce Readiness Toolkit. Okay, this is a very practical takeaway from everything we covered. Really sums it up nicely. It provides you really a chance to kind of pause, check readiness before pressure hits, right? These 3 questions will really surface where teams are exposed fairly quickly. So as you'll see, question 1, which roles are most impacted by the upcoming change that we're planning? Question 2, where do we have limited or fragile coverage today, presently? And question 3 is really just, are our supervisors and leads equipped to manage the new workflows, right? So what you'll find is that most organizations may already know the answers, right? They just never have walked through them intentionally or even put them on paper. So like, you aren't trying to predict everything, but when teams walk through this early on, transitions seem to be much easier to manage. And when we don't, issues show up in varying ways at very predictable stages as well. So the best way to manage that change is really to prepare. And we also wanted to leave you with 3 quick wins you can start today. So if you take one thing back from today, it would be awesome to start here, right? These don't require a new system or a budget, just your time and your visibility across the business. Okay, so first, look for places where only one person knows how something runs. This will be your critical points of function. And make sure your critical workflows, make sure they have backup coverage, right? You want to cross-train your users tied to these workflows. If someone has to step out of office, who is next up in line that can cover them and enable the operations keeps on moving smoothly, okay? And finally, the third thing would be decide ahead of time. How are you going to handle pressure spikes instead of figuring it out mid-project? So map your labor mix for your known 2026 pressure points, as well as even 2027, right? The further out you can look, then the further clarity and visibility you might have in what you're trying to accomplish. Okay, so essentially, most operational problems during change aren't technical. They come as surprises, but these questions will help minimize and reduce those surprises. And when your team is prepared, you give your chance a greater chance for your system to really be used the way it was intended to. So yeah, that's really what we wanted to hope to leave you guys with today. Okay, hopefully this was very insightful. Hopefully you went through it and you thought about your own organization and connected the talking points, right? And simply wanted to open up, hear what you guys have to say. If you have any questions, we'd love to kind of go through a Q&A.
Fantastic. Thank you both for the insights. That was absolutely great. And yeah, if anybody wants to unmute themselves, if you have any questions, now's the time we could go ahead and do that. Doesn't seem like anybody's unmuting as of yet, but I do have a few questions here for you guys. And the first one is, how should leaders plan their workforce as they introduce new systems or automation?
Jarrett, I can attack this one. So how should leaders, sorry, can you say that one more time, Robbie?
Yeah, how should leaders plan their workforce as they introduce new systems or automation?
Yeah, great question. So in terms of how to plan your workforce, currently it'll be very important. You got to start with your current state. So we recommend always looking at, okay, this is our current headcount. This is our current skill set that we have internally. With this current skill set, is our team already enabled? Do we have the necessary capacity to actually carry out the projects that we want to complete? And if not, at that point, you need to assess, is it a matter of upskilling? Are there certifications that our team is missing? Do I need to bring in an external consultant to help upskill our team? Or is it simply a case where that gap is too much, where you need to actually hire another full-time employee to come in and take on that additional responsibility? So that's usually the best starting point, is assessing current state and thinking about your future state and where you want to get to. Feel free to add on, Jarrett.
Yeah, no, just the anticipation stage is your key point to look at, like Jerron mentioned, what your current state is today, and whether they will be able to absorb the change essentially through their skills, and is there upskilling that we need to do with current folks on the floor, and as Jerron mentioned, that could be through additional consultants, or do we need a super user or an ERP champion to come in to kind of relieve the pressure through the groups, essentially.
Beautiful. So, and where are manufacturers struggling the most when it comes to finding the right people for today's production environments?
Yeah, I don't mind answering that one there, Robbie. I think a lot of times, companies are so involved in their day-to-day practice, and, a lot of, technology adoption is happening in today's market. But what they don't understand is it's not an easy learn. You can't just learn a system if you've never been introduced to it before. So a lot of times people think that they're ready for change and ERP rollouts or even automation installs. And what happens is they realize quickly through that rollout that their current folks are not equipped to handle that change. And that's when they're scrambling to find the right fits within the gaps that they're seeing and that are persistent throughout the change. And what happens there is they're being reactive and not proactive in that case. So I think a lot of companies need to start looking, if they are making these changes, we do need specialized organizations like OpTalent to kind of reach out to understand what they need, and throughout the process where it's more important to put those people in order to make sure that it's a seamless delivery on all fronts.
My final question for the two of you is, how are the top manufacturers approaching retention and upskilling as technology evolves today?
Yeah, I can start with that one. So what we've seen work really well is that in terms of retention, a lot of them offer certifications and learning opportunities, which are covered by the business, right? So that is a huge benefit for a lot of people. They don't have to come out of pocket to further their skills. So it's all about investing in your people, or you're not going to only invest in your employees when you first bring them on and you onboard them, but it's really a continuous process, right? So I want to make sure that my production line worker is continuously up to date with the newest best practices in the industry before they feel antiquated or a bit stuck in our environment. So that's the key thing that I've noticed, where, hey, let's invest in our people, let's cover these certifications, make sure we have really good benefits for them, and then they tend to stick around. Jarrett?
Yeah, and I think a lot of it, when you're a lean team, and we covered this through the presentation, a lot of times you're relying on single users to be, those super users throughout the process, and we don't have a backup. A lot of times, people do get sick. They go home for a couple of days, and you're stuck with the problem and can't be fixed through that super user. So I think a lot of time that retention is built through having backup plans as well. So the current, employees are not feeling like they're being burnt out. They have to wear too many hats, and they're really overworked, in parallel to learning this new technology, to learning all these new things that they've never had in the business before. So it is a lot of tasks to be absorbed by people. So it's important to understand that they need to have support in the back end through that transition.
Incredible. Well, that is our time for today. I'd like to thank Jerron and Jarrett for presenting for us today, and I'd like to thank everybody who showed up. I hope you all learned something, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it. Thanks, Robbie.
Thank you, guys.